Morning, everybody. Great to be here and joined with you once again. And of course, this is a hot topic, primarily because it's something that is, well, you Americans, with no disrespect, I mean, I'm Canadian, but used to look at us Europeans with pity for the longest number of years, like, oh, every time I came back to Toronto or here in the US, how are things in London? And unfortunately, that has now spilled over such that I can come here and say, and how are things in the US of A? Because frankly, this antisemitism, as we will demonstrate, is never unique to one particular place or locality, but tends to spread like a germ throughout. But let's begin in the first instance. There were these two young Jewish brothers who were literally bounced from pillar to post. They could not be tolerated in any Jewish school because they were so badly behaved. And in the end, they were finally moved into some very staunch Christian reformatory school that had zero tolerance for any kind of misbehavior. And the older brother is waiting in the headmaster, the principal's office, while the younger brother is waiting down the hall. The principal is a big burly priest sitting behind his desk, and he looks to the older brother and he says to him, "Young man, where is God?" And the boy shifts a little bit uneasily and says nothing. He says, "Young man, I asked you a question. Where is God?" Again, he moves around, uncomfortable, looks down, not a word. "Young man," and he comes menacingly from around the side of his desk, towering over this little child, says, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is God?" And the boy suddenly looks up, jumps out of his chair, goes running out of the office, goes running down the hall, runs bang smack into his younger brother, says, what is it? He goes, "We got to get out of here, man. They lost God and they're blaming us." And that's our discussion here today. They're always blaming us. I want to look at the cause of anti-Semitism, its effects, and what our response ought to be. And I want to look at it in the first instance from the perspective of Jewish history, focusing on three very well-known main events and determine how that translates into our modern-day reality. Because standing in this, for the 21st century, we have advanced in every facet of civilization. We have progressed from the jet age to the space age, from the telegraph to the superhighway, from rampant disease to advanced medicine, from prevailing poverty to incalculable opulence. But one malevolence, one historical ill still lurks every bit in our midst: the gross intolerance of some against others who may look, act, or believe different to themselves. And to be sure, anti-Semitism, like any form of racism, isn't born. It's taught. I have an 11-year-old daughter who you'll see running around here at the retreat. You know what she hates? I just asked her before coming down here. Going to sleep and spinach. That's all. Everything else will essentially be molded by us, her parents. If we teach our kids tolerance and respect, then that's what they will know. And if when they grow older, they are harboring hatred in their hearts and expressing all kinds of racial or anti-Semitic content, then know that they're often just likely mirroring your own prejudices. And what that essentially suggests is that anti-Semitism, as irrational a phenomena as it is, it's never been eradicated. At best, it's been suppressed over a period of time, because it wasn't fashionable, because the Holocaust has delineated such taboo into being able to be conditioned to stay somewhere below the radar. Society conditions us to curb our prejudices, but the sentiment does filter through. And if you hear someone saying something today about Jews, he or she didn't suddenly, I maintain, acquire this newfound bias. It's something they will have learned from the language in their own homes or their schools or their culture. So let's consider three incidents as they are unique in the context of the Tanakh. The first is, of course, the famous confrontation between Yaakov and Esau, Jacob and Esau. This is the literal Jewish people and Esau, the enemy of the Jewish people. He's approaching. He meets up with Jacob after a long period of separation. And the Torah tells us when he approaches him, Vayishakehu, and he kissed him. And if you look in a Torah scroll, or indeed in a Chumash, you'll find that on top of each of the letters where it says, and he kissed him, there is a dot, very unusual, on top of each of the letters. It's So the letters don't stand alone. There's a dot on top of each of the letters. And the commentaries, of course, need to explain this. Why are there dots on top of the letters in the Torah scroll? And he kissed him. And they explain because it was an abnormal action. They offer two explanations. One is that it was an abnormal kiss in that, come on, Esau hated Yaakov. He didn't really want to kiss him. It looked like he wanted to kiss him, but he really moved in to bite his neck. The other explanation is that actually, no, he didn't really kiss him. He moved in this instance, with intent to give him a genuine kiss. So what's so abnormal about that? Well, it's abnormal in the sense that as a general principle, Esau hates Yaakov. And therefore, for suddenly him to find himself kissing Yaakov is abnormal. In other words, whichever way you cut it, it's an abnormal kiss. And it's an abnormal kiss because Esau hates Yaakov, whether he's intending to really bite him or whether in this one abnormal circumstance he's kissing him. That statement forms the crux of reality of anti-Semitism. It is, for all intent and purposes, an irrational hatred that has manifested itself through the ages and regardless of circumstance. It's a cardinal law of reality that exists without rhyme or reason. Now let's look at the second example. When does the whole story of the Egyptian servitude begin? We all know the story. Jews spent 210 years in Egypt. When did it actually all begin? Here's a little bit of fascinating insight, and stay with me on this. If you look at the Torah portion, the concluding book of Bereshis, how are we going to do that? Do you want to figure something out? We have the concluding book of Bereshis, which is Vayechi. Vayechi is telling us about the death of Jacob in the land of Egypt. And as a general rule, whenever you look at Torah portions in the Torah, they are separated. There's a significant gap between the Torah portion that we'll read this Shabbat and the one that we'll read next Shabbat, or indeed the one after that, etc. Very, very occasionally, there's no gaps. The two Torah portions are literally following in sequence, one from the other, without any gap whatsoever. And when that happens, when the portions are closed, as it were, then the commentaries will always ask, why is this portion closed? And they'll have to offer an explanation for it. So this portion is discussing about the death of Jacob, and the Torah asks, and the commentaries ask, why is it that this portion is closed? That is to say that it follows immediately from the previous portion in the Torah scroll without any gaps, and says because at this moment in time, the eyes of the Jewish people also became closed. And why did the eyes of the Jewish people, their eyes and their hearts become closed? Because now the tsaras hashibud, the pain of the servitude in Egypt begins. Here's the problem. We know, and it's established fact, that the actual servitude in Egypt did not begin until the last of the actual brothers, the last of the tribes, died. That was the brother Levi, who died well after his father Jacob died. So there's an inherent contradiction over here, because on the one hand, the suggestion is, we know the servitude started after Levi, the last of the brothers, died, which was a fair bit later, and yet over here already, as Jacob dies, the portions are closed to tell us that guess what? The reason why it's closed is because now the hearts and the minds and the eyes of the Jewish people are already becoming closed, they're becoming despondent because of the tsaras hashibud, the pain of the servitude. How do we explain this contradiction? The answer is this. There's something that happened, something very significant at this earliest moment in time that already gave us insight into what was happening. If you look in the Torah, a little bit of careful biblical analysis, you'll find that after Jacob dies, it says Joseph went and spoke to the household of Pharaoh and asked them to speak to Pharaoh to arrange burial for his father, as he promised, in the land of Israel, to be taken out of Egypt in the land of Israel. What's the obvious problem here? Why is Joseph speaking to the household of Pharaoh and asking them to go on his behalf to speak to Pharaoh, to ask for his father to be taken to the land of Israel? You're viceroy. You're second in command. Why don't you go to Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh yourself? And what is clear from this is that something happened. Joseph's prestige fell enormously. He felt unable to go to Pharaoh himself. He had to get someone else to represent him. Jacob was the elder statesman, but with his passing, it all changes. That was the beginning of the end. Who's the one person to whom all of Egypt owes everything? Joseph. He's the one who saved the economy. He saved their lives during the famine. He's appointed, as we said, viceroy, and now all of a sudden, he has no access to Pharaoh. He has to implore the rest of the household of Pharaoh to go and speak on his behalf, to ask for his father to be taken for burial. And if his luster falls, and it's obvious, then everyone hanging on his coattails is now already in trouble as well. He has fallen from stature. He doesn't have the same access as before. And hence already now the storm clouds are gathering. Yes, the actual servitude in Egypt kicked in, as it were, when Levi, the last of the brothers, died a fair bit later on. But already now, at this earliest point in time, after Jacob dies, a good number of years before, Soras Hashiba, that's what Rashi says. Not the actual servitude began, but the pain, the premonition, the storm clouds that are gathering, indicating, boy, there's something very dangerous hovering on the horizon. Because Joseph himself has no longer any access. He has to go to the household to appeal on his behalf. That already smells of something very, very disconcerting. And here we have a painful example of reality. Make no mistake about it. We can curry as much favor as we want with governments. We can establish however close a relationship, but when they want to forget, they will forget. Joseph is their hero. He did so much for them. And yet somewhere down the line, the selected amnesia kicks in, such that rather than interpreting his hard work of taxation and saving the economy, they'll say, he lined his own pockets. He was the viceroy, but hey, they'll always look for an excuse to attack. And the third example is, of course, Amalek. But let's not talk about Amalek, the Amalekites who attacked the Jews as they left Egypt. Let's jump ahead many generations to a descendant of Amalek and a famous story that we know of in the Purim of Haman, who was his descendant. Haman was from Amalek. And we know that Haman himself was the first to want to initiate a final solution. He wanted to kill, as in the words of the Megillah that we read on Purim, men, women, and children. He wanted to wipe everybody out. And how does it begin? If you look at the story, just to briefly recap in the Megillah, Haman approaches the king Achashverosh, and he says, there is an unusual nation in your midst, and they're spread out, etc., etc., etc. And he says, you know what, I'll give you 10,000 silver coins to allow me the opportunity to go and do what I want with them. And what does Achashverosh respond? Keep your money, don't worry, if only you will, just take them and do as you wish with them. Suddenly comes along the Talmud over here and offers us a very unusual and cryptic parable. To what is this compared, asked the Talmud? To two people. One has a field with a mound of dirt in it. The other has a field with a ditch in it. Says the owner of the field with the ditch to the owner of the man with the mound, please, let me pay you to take your mound of dirt so I can fill up my ditch. Says the owner of the mound in this field, by all means keep your money, if only you will just take my mound and go ahead and fill your ditch with it. Now normally, whenever the Talmud offers a parable, it's there to offer context of something that isn't clear in the actual story itself, but the story is perfectly clear to us. We know the exchange is pretty straightforward between Haman and Achashverosh, the king. Why does the Talmud have to step in over here and offer us this cryptic parable? Well, listen carefully to what the real message is over here. Achashverosh and Haman have two distinct attitudes towards the Jewish people. Achashverosh is the owner of the field with the mound of dirt. That mound of dirt, that's the Jewish people. But they are raised, they are above the ground. He perceives them with a certain kind of respect, a certain kind of dignity. Haman, on the other hand, is the man who has the field with the ditch in it. By definition, he perceives the Jewish nation as lowly and a degraded people. So they're coming from different perspectives. Haman wants to purchase the Jews as one would sheep to the slaughter, to subject them to a cruel and humiliating demise. He is as low as they can go, the ultimate hater. Achashverosh, on the other hand, recognizes their uniqueness, recognizes something special about the Jewish people, appreciates their value, and is a little bit concerned about their honor. You want to buy them to persecute them? By all means, if you want, take them, but keep your money. Have a little bit of respect for their exalted status. And this, friends, goes to the core of what exists then and is no less a reality today. There are two types of haters, two dimensions to anti-Semitism, if you will. There is the ignorant hater, like Achashverosh, and there is the malevolent hater, like Haman. That's been our reality from time immemorial until present day. The ignorant hater has absolutely no idea what Judaism really stands for. Maybe it's world dominance. After all, we talk about Mashiach, we talk about universal laws, and so on and so forth. Historically, this was already interpreted as like trying to make the world ours. For others, maybe it's not supremacy, but it's certainly superiority, the chosen people complex. Who do we really think we are? And for others still, the sum total of Judaism is inextricably linked with Israel, which is why whatever happens there invariably spills over into the diaspora as well. And the truth of the matter is, the tragic irony of all this is that Judaism is really the only one faith that insists that you have purpose by virtue of who you what you are. What do we mean when we speak about a chosen nation? It means our foremost objective is revealing the unity of God in a modern-day fragmented society. And whilst every other faith insists that the only way onto God is but through them, Judaism is not a proselytizing nation. Judaism doesn't go out seeking converts. Judaism maintains you can access God and find meaning and purpose in life by virtue of who you yourself are. So the ignorant hater finds the Jew an annoyance. It's a mound in his field. It's a strange phenomenon. It's something different to himself. There's something about the Jew that makes him or her feel strange inside. He can't explain it, it just does. And this sort of hater invariably coexists with the Jew and tolerates the Jew. And it is only when opportunity lends itself, when it becomes fashionable to vent the hatred, when it becomes excusable to boycott, then the same professor who shared your common room, or a business colleague who worked with you, or your neighbor who greeted you, will suddenly rear their ugly side. And these are people who may, on the one hand, look upon the Jew like Achashverosh with admiration and affection, or on the other hand, with some kind of hate or repulsion, and usually with a mixture of the two. And then there is the deeper dimension to anti-Semitism. Maimonides, the 12th century scholar and philosopher, once explained, as per the words of the Talmud, why was Mount Sinai, where we were given the Torah, so called? And the Talmud says, because the word Sinai sounds very similar to the word Sinna, which means hatred. And the Talmud says, because in that moment when we were given that Torah to become a light unto the nations, hatred itself came into the world. To put it in the words of Hitler himself, Yamach Shema, we must destroy the tyrannical God of the Jews and his life-denying 10 Commandments. Because that moment in Sinai imbued the Jew with an ambassadorship, with a great spiritual and moral responsibility. There is something, I say this unapologetically, about the Jewish mind, about the Jewish heart, about the Jewish home, about the Jewish family, and about the Jewish community that oozes spiritual nobility. The non-Jew senses it, is aware of it, dare I say sometimes even more so than the Jew. Sometimes they will acknowledge it. As President John Adams famously said, I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nation. But alas, all too often, there have been many that were inflamed by this uniqueness of this Jew, this ambassadorship, this light onto the nations. What was Haman's argument to the king? He says, they're different from us. Their laws are different than ours. He evokes within the king the aforementioned ignorant hatred and agitation. But Haman's own hatred comes from a much deeper place, like a ditch, somewhere at the core of his being. And as the Rebbe famously observes, could you think about this for a minute? The entire Persian Empire, the Megillah tells us, was bowing before Haman as per the king's instruction. One man, only one man refused to bow before him, Mordechai. And it tells us that Haman himself was filled with rage. He was incensed. You've got to ask yourself, the world is your oyster. One man doesn't bow, and that becomes your whole preoccupation. That's what consumes you to a point where you become preoccupied with that more than anything else. And yet the point is that Mordechai's behavior exposes something in Haman's heart. It triggered something within. It exposes the truth that Haman wasn't God. It manifested a feeling of emptiness which induced a deep-seated hatred, and then he had a choice. Deal with the effect or eradicate the cause. And so through the course of history, we've been hated on both fronts, whether out of sheer ignorance or unadulterated malevolence. Only today, of course, the buzzword is no longer Jew. Again, the post-Holocaust era has delineated that taboo to remain in place alongside other extreme forms of racial slur. So in place of Jew, we have Israel, Zionists. Because hating Jews is no longer politically correct. But hating Israel and Israelis is now the correct way to hate Jews today. People will tell you it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. They're just bleeding heart liberals who feel bad for whatever's going on in the Middle East. And whilst it's true, I will stress that for some you can separate the two. For the overwhelming majority, the lines have become fundamentally blurred, and reality speaks for itself. Because when a Jewish rabbi in Italy is stabbed on account of what's going on in Israel, and when a Jewish businessman in France is beaten because of what's going on in Israel, and when a Jewish professor is boycotted in the United States because of what's going on in Israel, and a Jewish student is cursed on the streets of London because of what's going on in Israel, then it's no longer to do with Israel and no longer to do with Zionism or with so-called occupation, and it has everything to do with Jew and Judaism and anti-Semitism. And the international BDS movement, like many self-proclaimed anti-Zionists, insists you can be against the policies of Israel without being against the Jewish people. Again, on the face of it, that may be true. But the hard fact is that Israel is known as the Jewish state, and the Jewish people see Israel as a safe haven from persecution. So whilst separate, the two are inextricably linked to the point and to the extent that one is invariably seen as an extension of the other. That these double standards exist speaks for itself. Mainstream culture is finding cover for the age-old hatred of Jews. They figured it out. So long as the attack is battered and flash-fried in a light coat of anti-Israel sentiment, and as long as you pretend you're fighting for human rights, then the rise of anti-Semitism is socially acceptable. Newsflash. Your anti-Zionist comment is anti-Semitic even if in every other second of your waking life you work to empower the oppressed and believe yourself not to have a racist ideology in your head. Those attributes just simply make it easier to say sorry afterwards. Your anti-Zionist comment is anti-Semitic when used in conjunction with any historical anti-Semitic slur, such as Zionists are money-grabbing, Zionists control the media, bank monopolizing, etc. Your anti-Zionist comment is anti-Semitic if you say you hate Zionists. People don't hate political philosophies enshrined by international law. You can find neoliberals morally bankrupt. You can find neoconservatism dangerous, but you don't hate liberals or conservatives. Your anti-Zionist comment is definitely anti-Semitic when you equate or compare Israel with Nazi Germany. Because if you liken an expansionist state at whose heart was the industrial extermination of the Jews to the only Jewish state, then you are engaging in anti-Semitic speech. You know, Shlomo Kalbach used to joke, when you're on campus and you ask someone, are you a Jew? And they reply, no, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Muslim, etc., you'll know they're telling the truth. But if they tell you, I'm just a plain human being, then you'll know in all likelihood they are Jewish. And the corollary of that today is, when you ask someone, do you condemn racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., and they say, yes, of course I do, great. But when you ask them to condemn anti-Semitism and they reply, oh, I condemn all forms of prejudice, you know you're probably talking to an anti-Semite. And let me add this. If you think random Islamic murder in Paris is terrorism, and random Islamic murder in London is terrorism, but random Islamic murder in Tel Aviv is not, then you are an anti-Semite. You know, they tell of this traveling salesman. He made a very deliberate point, nice Jewish guy, of always going to shul. Wherever he was, anywhere in the world, find the local minyan, go and daven, great. Problem was, he was in Shropshire, which is the backwaters of the UK, and there isn't a shul for 100 miles. What's he to do? This is the next best thing. It's Sunday morning. He took his tallis and tefillin and he went into the local church. At least he can get something of a feeling. I don't know. He sat in the back, puts on his tallis and tefillin. Nobody's around. He starts to daven. No problem. A little while later, however, he loses track of time. People are coming in for service, and they're looking a little bit uncomfortable. The priest observes this, and he says, now, will all non-Christians please make their way to the exit? This guy is oblivious. He's just davening away. More and more people are coming in, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Will all those who genuinely feel that they don't belong here please go now? And this guy pulls his tallis over his head, and he's swaying back and forth, completely oblivious to everything going around him. And the place soon fills up to capacity, and everybody's looking really strange and uncomfortable. And the priest suddenly allows, all Jews leave now. The guy suddenly pauses, stops, whoa. Takes off his tallis, takes off his tefillin, folds it all up, rolls it all up, puts it in his bag, puts it under one hand, walks to the front of the church, takes the statue of you-know-who off the cross, puts it under his other hand, and says, come on, Bubala, we're not wanted here. Throughout the course of history, we have been told you're not wanted here. And many historians and many scholars, including many Jews themselves, will choose to view this ongoing obsession with the Jew not as something uniquely connected to Jews or Judaism, but a multitude of isolated events resulting from distinct circumstances. So Arabs hated us because they claim we're occupiers. But the fact that they hated us before 1967, before settlements or settlers, begs clarity. Germans hated us because we were the scapegoat for the economy. Christians hated us because we supposedly killed their God. Stalin hated us because we were capitalists, whilst Europeans in the Middle Ages hated us because of our financial success. The hard fact is that anti-Semitism has existed far too long and in far too many disparate cultures to tolerate a claim that in each instance it is because of some distinct factor disconnected from being Jewish. To put it in the words of the book, Why the Jews? Economic depressions do not account for gas chambers. Jews have been hated because they were rich and because they were poor, because they were capitalists and because they were communists, because they believed in tradition and because they were rootless cosmopolitans, because they kept to themselves and because they penetrated everywhere. Anti-Semitism is not a belief but a virus. The human body has an immensely sophisticated immune system which develops defenses against viruses. But it's penetrated, however, because viruses mutate, anti-Semitism mutates. And this then brings me to the next point, the effects of anti-Semitism. Let's look back on the three historical events. Jacob and Esau, the story, the way the Torah relates it. Isaac wanted to confer blessings on Esau, the malevolent son, whilst Rebekah was insistent that the blessings should be given to Jacob. In the end, taking advantage of Isaac's vision impairment, Jacob disguises himself as Esau such that when he presents himself before his father, Isaac declares, by listening to his voice and then touching his hands, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Here's how I understand the story. Isaac, who was the progenitor of the Jewish nation, felt that in order for the Jewish people to survive, some sort of partnership can be established between Jacob and Esau. One will be the moral voice, and the other will be the protector and the defender. He perceives a world in which Jacob and Esau can be partners. One will be able to communicate the moral and spiritual calling of civilization, and the other will always be there as and when danger presents itself to step up to the plate. But along comes Rebekah, She comes from that world. And she knows all too well that Esau cannot be trusted to defend Jacob. She knows that 193 member states might come together as a United Nations to ensure peace and stability in the world. But it will always single out Israel as a leading violator of health rights, as it did earlier last year and again this year. It'll single out Israel as a violator of women's rights, as it did again earlier last year. Despite being the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, as we know, routinely faces more criticism and condemnation of the United Nations than any other country, including those that systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Rebecca knows that Esau cannot be trusted as a partner in defending Jacob. You, she says, must go and take the blessings. You must assume the persona of Esau. You must be prepared to stand up for yourself when no one else is going to be there to stand up for you. And friends, here is where the world is making its biggest mistake. Sure, credit should be granted to those governments who have introduced legislation against race hate crimes, Holocaust denial, etc. But what does legislation really do apart from suppress something rather than genuinely eradicate it? Anti-Semitism is not some sickness like polio that can be eradicated by social and legislative medicine. What starts with Israel doesn't end with Israel. What starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. You've heard the expression canary in the coal mine. Miners go down with caged canaries into the tunnels. If there's dangerous, noxious fumes, the canary dies, the miners know we've got to get out. As one journalist in a Canadian national newspaper wrote, Jews are the canary in the coal mine of human civilization. In other words, what starts with Israel doesn't end with Israel, as events all over the Middle East now proves. And what starts with Jews doesn't end with Jews, as tragic events in all parts of the world as recent as last week has so blatantly demonstrated. Renowned American journalist Mary Brenner wrote an article in which she describes the riots that happened in Paris on a Saturday back in July 2014, when a pro-Palestinian demonstration culminated with thousands of protesters chanting "Mort aux Juifs," or death to the Jews. And what she describes as the summer of hate, she wrote, "Anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with them. Stalin began with Jews, but didn't end with them. Hitler began with Jews, but didn't end with them. Make no mistake about it. Of course, it's our problem, but it's not just our problem. It evolves into a global problem. Which brings me straight into what is the legitimate Jewish response. Referring back to the Jacob-Esau phenomena once more, in the end, we know that Isaac gives the blessings to Jacob. And in so doing, he declares, as we said, the voice is the voice of Jacob and the hands are the hands of Esau. Isaac is effectively merging both realities into one entity. Yes, you must be the voice of reason. You have a moral calling. You must be ambassadors to the universe and never lose sight of the greater objective. But part and parcel of that calling is that sometimes you will need to use the hands of Esau. Sometimes you will need to stand up and defend yourself in every which way, because that too is part of your global responsibility, an integral part of your ambassadorship. Because a world without room for Jews is one that has no room for difference, and a world that lacks space for difference lacks space for humanity itself. Some argue that we're better off keeping a low profile, as has become the acceptable norm, certainly in many parts of Europe, where rabbis even get up from their pulpits and advocate, don't wear your kippah on the street, etc. I don't buy it. I maintain that when reverting to what author Israel Zangwill once referred to as the ghetto shtup, walking with our heads down, keeping below the radar, then we're just merely feeding into the stereotype. We are nurturing the germ. We score an own goal, as they say. If the whole point and purpose of anti-Semitism is to reduce the Jewish people into oblivion, then surely we're accommodating the process when we choose to lie low, as it were. Kind of reminds me of a rabbi in Manchester who was standing outside his shul one morning in his tallis and tefillin, a colleague of mine, waiting to find that 10th man for the minyan because someone inside had yahrzeit and needed to say Kaddish, and people are walking by and casting him a curious glance. Sisters are blowing in the cold English wind, and finally one man suddenly stops and says, "What's the matter with you? What are you doing standing outside like that? Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" And the rabbi looks at him and says, "You're the one I'm looking for. Come inside. I need my 10th man." What was Moses' first experience when stepping out into the world? Encountering an Egyptian beating up on a Jew. What does he do? He smites the Egyptian. In today's jargon, he neutralizes the threat. The next time we're introduced to him, Moses that is the very next day, when he encounters two Jews quarreling with each other, and they call him out on it. And they say, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian the day before? All through history, there have been Jewish pacifists who will rebuke Moshe for demonstrating leadership and sometimes taking the necessary action. But in the very next verse, we're told how Moses became very afraid. Ochen noda hadavar, he says, now the matter is known. And then immediately afterwards, we're told how he's on the run. Observe the commentaries. Already at this earliest phase of Moshe's life, he became very afraid. And the fact that he becomes very afraid is juxtaposed with the fact that he had to go on the run, is because if we give in to our fears, then that becomes our end result. It's only when the Jew is afraid that he has to go on the run. Had Moses stood tall with the same conviction with which he had killed the Egyptian the day before, then things might have panned out altogether different. We don't have to be pacifists. We need not be silent observers. We need to confront the world with an unwavering commitment in both the spiritual and physical dynamics of our reality. In the first instance, always with the voice of Jacob. And when necessary, with the hands of Esau. Referring back again now also to the Purim story. The Talmud famously explains, how did Haman score his PR offensive with Achashverosh? What did he say? They're spread out. As the Talmud explains, they're lazy. They never work. Again, as the Talmud explains, because of Shabbos, because of Pesach. They won't eat our food. They won't marry our women. A fly falls into their wine, they'll spill out the fly and drink the wine. But you, Achashverosh, if you drink the wine, they'll spill out the wine altogether and they won't drink it at all. Later, when Esther steps in to save the Jewish people, what does she do? She steps up to the plate and she says, Ki nimkarnu ani v'ami, they are my people. She tugs at his heartstrings. And for good measure, she also throws in the economic argument. If you're going to just kill them off, that's of no benefit to you. Sell them at least as slaves, and at least then you'll make some money. Question is, how does she turn Achashverosh's heart around by simply saying, Ani v'ami, they are me and my people? What about all the claims that Haman brought before, all those initial complaints? They're lazy, they don't work, they don't listen to you, they won't marry us, etc., etc. Everything he highlighted before about our different laws, our different behavior, our different mindset, it's all true. It swayed Achashverosh. Esther doesn't address any of that within Achashverosh's mind. And yet, she does. Because she says, Ani v'ami. These are my people. This is my identity. This is who I am. Achashverosh loved Esther's grace and her nobility. He loved her essence. He loved her soul. She says to the king, you love me? You love my essence? You know what my essence is? I am a Jew. These are my people. Yes, our laws are different. Is that a bad thing? It's what defines me. Yes, we have days when we don't work. Is that a bad thing? It's what you love about me. You see, the point is that sometimes you can get into the nitty-gritty of the debate and explain this law and this passage, etc., but that will only make a little bit of a difference, maybe to those who care enough to want to listen. The ultimate retort is Ani v'ami, live by the standard to which you hold yourself, because only when you respect yourself will the world respect you as well. And if you don't, then don't expect much from the world either. Rabbi Melech of Lezhensk of the 18th century was conducting a farbrengen, a gathering on a Friday night at his home. And amongst the many assembled was a certain rabbi called Rabbi Moshe Leib Sassover, who went on later on to become a grand rabbi himself. He was then the disciple of Rabbi Elimelech. And at a certain point, Rabbi Elimelech looked at him and said to him, say something, share with us a thought. At first he was reluctant, then he said, okay. It was the week in which we were reading the story of the Exodus in the Torah. And it says that God, Pasach al Bate B'nai Yisrael. We call it Pesach, Passover, because God jumped over the homes of the Jewish people. And yet, if you translate the words literally, it says Pasach al Bate, which translates literally as God jumped on the homes of the Jewish people. How do we explain that? And he went on to say, when God and the angels up above looked down and saw the determination and the willingness and the sacrifice of the Jewish people in that moment in time, they came down and they started to jump and sing and dance on the homes of the Jewish people, pointing inward and saying, Adavain Tayyid, here lives a Jew, here lives a Jew. And when he finished his explanation, he proceeded to jump up on the table and pointed to his master, Rabbi Elimelech, and he said as well, Davain Tayyid, here goes a Jew, here lives a Jew. We have to tell the world, with every ugly protest you hold condemning Israel, while simultaneously throwing chairs, tables, and stones at Jews, we stand that much straighter. With every anti-Semitic, ignorant, malign hashtag you tweet, we wave our banner of pride that much higher. With every provocation you bring to the United Nations, hoping that maybe Israel will disappear when denounced on some kind of political platform, we are reminded once more how fortunate we are to be Jewish. And with every odious demonstration, every violent aspersion, every savage attack, with every lie fabricated and every abuse, we stand that much prouder that we belong to a religion, a nation, a belief system where others will point to us and say, Adavain Tayyid, here goes a Jew, where our optimism replaces pessimism and our faith exceeds our fears. Because we, the Jews, the miners, canaries, must always remain moral ambassadors in today's world. And by the same token, we should never feel the need to apologize or the right to defend ourselves. We can never let hate affect our idea of who we are. Pride is always a healthier response than shame. I'm going to leave you with this final thought. How many tablets are there? We know there's 10 commandments, and we know there are only 2 tablets. Question, God was already going to put them 5 and 5. Why didn't he just put them all on 1 tablet? Why are there 2 tablets? So there's a discussion about that in great length amongst the commentaries. But then there's an altogether different question, which doesn't really get discussed. Why were the tablets made of stone? I mean, one of the reasons we suggest 2 tablets is simply because we know God went to the different nations, right? The people of Ishmael, what does it say? Don't steal, forget it. People of Esau, what does it say? Don't kill, forget it. The people of Israel, how much? Free? Okay, we'll take 2. But why stone? Have you ever wondered? God has access to all the material of this universe. Look at the Mishkan, the sanctuary, the tabernacle, the subsequent temples. They were made out of all this magnificent material. Why the tablets, the core of the Jewish faith, made of stone? Stock answer is simply that stone doesn't rot. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't wear. It's permanent, and that's the reality of a Jewish commitment to one's faith must be as well. But then there's another profound insight. You know where the stone came from? The stone, according to some, was the very stone upon which Moses sat when the Jewish people were battling Amalek. Just prior to the story of the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people encountered Amalek, the first all original anti-Semites for the first time. And when they were waging their battle, Moses himself sat on a stone with his hands pointed heavenward, etc. And that same stone was subsequently used for these 10 commandments. Why? When hate is rational, based on some fear that has some logic to it, however distorted the logic, however unjustified, it can be reasoned with. But when hate is a baseless, irrational hatred, someone hates you because of your very existence, then frankly, that hate will only disappear when you disappear. So God gives these 10 commandments that formed the essence of Judaism on stone that Moses himself sat on when confronting this very anti-Semitism. Torah is described with the words, all of its paths are peaceful. The Jew was, is, and always will be committed wholeheartedly to peace. But they're made from stone, the very stone that Moses sat on, to tell you and me that there is no room for bleeding heart liberalism. There is no room for negotiation. There is no sand in which to bury your head or ivory tower to climb and pontificate from. The threat is real, and you have to challenge it, and you have to battle it, and you have to eradicate it. Always remember this anecdote about the farmer who had an old mule that fell into the well. It was a dry well, and the mule was braying loudly. And the farmer thinks to himself, well, there's a simple solution here. The mule is old, the well is dry, I can put them both out, solve both problems at once, put the mule out of its misery and fill up the well all at once. Gathers all the surrounding farmers, and they start to proceed to fill up the dry well and put the mule out of its misery. And as the dirt is falling on the mule's back, it's braying loudly, it's almost hysterical. Shovelful of dirt after shovelful of dirt is falling on the mule's back. He becomes hysterical. But as the farmer and his neighbors continued shoveling and the dirt is hitting his back, a thought suddenly struck him. It suddenly dawned upon him that if every time a shovelload of dirt lands on his back, he should just shake it off so as to be able to form a little platform underneath him, and then he'll be able to step up. And that's what he proceeded to do. Blow after blow, he kept telling himself, shake it off and step up, shake it off and step up. No matter how painful the blows or distressing the situation seemed, the old mule fought panic and just kept right on shaking it off and stepping up. And it wasn't long before the old mule, battered and exhausted, stepped triumphantly over the wall of that well. What seemed likely to bury him actually blessed him, all because of the manner in which he handled his adversity. Friends, that's life. That's the story of the Jewish people from time immemorial, facing its problems and responding to all the problems out there, not with bitterness or self-pity, but rather with a strength and a fortitude. For 2,000 years, we have been enduring this gullus, and we are still here to tell the tale. We, the Jewish people, are a collective affirmation of life, and our existence and our achievements are a living testimony to one of Judaism's greatest messages to humankind: the principal defeat of tragedy by the power of hope. So I don't care what they say on CNN or BBC or the New York Times. As Jews, we are not afraid to be different. It's better to be a hero walking alone in one direction than with a crowd walking in the wrong direction. They might wretchedly and tragically kill our brothers and sisters. They might pitifully attack us on the streets of London or the campuses of UCLA, and we shed a tear, and we cry, and we lament. But they will never, ever break our spirit, not then and not now. We have to put the message out there to the world, and perhaps even more so to our children, our grandchildren, the next generation, a message of pride, of dignity, a message that declares loud and clear that Am Yisrael Chai, we, God's chosen people, have, are, and will live on forevermore. Thank you very much.